and devices used by Ernest Hemingway in Soldier's Home. So the first we would have third person, because our narrator is unknown, not in the story, but we know the thoughts and feelings of Krebs. That would be our protagonist. The narrator remains detached, mirroring Hemingway's iceberg theory. So remember, everything in a Hemingway story is supposed to have a deeper meaning, and we're expected to read between the lines. So even when we meet Krebs and he's giving us just a very bare minimum, he shows the rind does not show in the picture. Um, he doesn't even explain this. So we could maybe say that when Krebs was in Germany, this would have been an area that was occupied during World War II. We don't really know what would have happened to him there. He doesn't describe any of his experiences. In our sparse dialogue, he's not really talking to anyone. And then we have our setting, a small Oklahoma town post World War One. The story unfolds in Krebs's family home, the town's streets, and public spaces like the library. The setting reflects a quiet, conservative Midwest contrasting Krebs' wartime experience. So when we're at his house, you could also say he does spend a lot of time on his front porch. So you could even be specific to the places he is at his setting. He stands at the outskirts. He has been to like a dressing room at a dance. So it kind of seems weird if adults are going to dances, but that would have been something people did um, back in the early 1900s. It'd be like a way people were socializing. So places like this can also show the conservativeness because technically this wouldn't be everywhere people were going to these dances, but it was like a way that young people could kind of be supervised. Um, Co-ed dances, they're still expected to, have certain standards of behavior when you're socializing with people of the opposite sex. And then he would have him sleeping, eating lunch at home. Here he is on the front porch. It's going to talk about that. These would be the things that he's spending his time doing. And we can highlight this one because that's going to be a good part to show the setting. And then we have Harold. So he is our young veteran, emotionally detached, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life, passive, alienated, avoids complexity. His religious, well meaning mother, who pressures him to conform to societal expectations. We know that in the conversation that they had, where she was like, why can't you get a job like so and so? And this would be his sister. You could say, when she's asking him things, she actually means it. She's not trying to be mean to him or anything. When she says, "Why do you ever get up?" This definitely tells us he sleeps a lot, right? And here's his mother, where she's going to ask him about why he can't be like Charlie Simmons. So that could be evidence of how she is representing traditional values. Mr. Krebs, we don't even really meet him at all. That's the dad. We just hear some things about him that he can use the car because the dad said. That there's not much you could really characterize the dad just by the fact that he never talks about his dad. So we can assume his dad really is just kind of ignoring him and the way that he's going about his life. We have the tone detached, melancholic, and understated. Hemingway uses flat, matter of fact to convey Krebs's emotional numbness. So this would just be, and there is you do get, if you wanted to say there is a depressing tone, because we as a reader, we might feel bad for Krebs. Our conflicts. Krebs feels out of place in the town's expectations. That would be, you could say, character versus society or character versus self here. It kind of goes hand in hand as he's battling emotional alienation and an inability to feel connected after the war. He struggles with loss of purpose and an inability to live authentically. I can't say that word, sorry. Authentically. And never mind. So here he's lacks authenticity. You could say it like that if you can't say authentically. And when he's talking about how he has to lie to kind of feel like he's fitting in or sharing his story, And then in our final ending, how does he solve his conflict? Well, he just leaves. And, we don't even really know. We can assume his mother prayed for him. He took hard to keep his life from being complicated. You could say the complicated part of his life is what his family's wanting him to do. Have relationships, have a job. He had felt sorry for his mother and she made him lie. He would go to Kansas City and get a job and would feel all right about that. There would be one more scene, maybe, before he got away. He would not go down to his father's office. He would miss that one. He wanted his life to go smoothly. It had just gotten going that way. Well, that was all over now anyway. He would go over to the schoolyard and watch Helen play indoor baseball. Here he basically admits that like his life is never going to go smoothly. He basically is saying he's always going to be dealing with these feelings of alienation, depression, not fitting in. So, if we were going to say, did Krebs overcome his conflicts? No. I mean, maybe we could say with his mother, but the way he overcame it was just by leaving. And also maybe with his father, character versus character, both his parents. He doesn't even say goodbye there. So you have alienation and isolation, disconnection from family, society, and himself. Lost generation of World War I soldiers. This is actually known as something. If you wanted to look that up, what was the World War I lost generation? The cost of war. The psychological toll of war lingers, stripping Krebs of emotional capacity. You could say, like, if you were going to do a central idea theme state or a central idea like literary analysis essay, you could say how if we were looking at the economy, um, we don't know how much these returning soldiers could contribute. Like, and even now, if uh, the harm they could do into a society, if they're not given help, and in this case, we would assume Krebs could have rehabilitated if he was given services and assistance. Krebs' aversion to lying about his war experience highlights society's demand for glorified narratives. That's definitely another thing. He wasn't he was in battles, we can assume, but the fact that he had stayed in an occupied area that was already like maybe occupied, conquered, he might not have had the same like in the trenches at the front type war experiences. And he's also always reading the books about the war, maybe trying to place himself because in at least in the books, it gives him some credit in a way. And then he's defining himself in a world that no longer makes sense. Obviously, him watching the girls and things like that. Because here we could have the girls symbolize societal expectations, marriage and normalcy that he can observe, but he just cannot engage with. And then our motifs are things that come up more than once in a story. The mention of what he's doing day after day, um, Krebs's minimal dialogue, silence. This is showing the motif of his alienation and his struggles. This Krebs's early detachment, when he's lying about his war stories, you could say that that's going to foreshadow the fact that he doesn't talk about this with his family either. He just can't face what has happened to him and talk about it in a way that would, he just doesn't talk about it. And that part here, his lies were unimportant lies. So this part would be our foreshadowing, um, where he says, he had said Krebs acquired a nausea in regard to experience that is a result of untruth and exaggeration. And when he occasionally met another man who had really been a soldier and talked a few minutes in the dressing room at a dance hall, he fell into the easy pose of the old soldier among other soldiers, that he had been badly, sickeningly frightened all the time. So this foreshadows, you know, how bad he really had it in the war, how difficult this all is to process for him. And that could be our foreshadowing. And then him observing these girls. That one was one where he was talking about their bobs and whatnot. Here, he liked to look at them. There were many good looking girls. Most of them had their hair cut short. He's watching them. He liked to watch them walking under the shade. He liked their Dutch collars. He liked their hair. Clearly, he has an attraction. And at one point, we could assume he wanted to get married and have romance in his life, like everybody would want to. But he's just on the outskirts of this, observing, because in the end, we do know he gets a job of sorts. He obviously doesn't seem like he's very, like, passionate about it, but he definitely doesn't get a wife. So that could foreshadow that resolution, the ending. Krebs returns home but feels more alienated than ever. That would be our irony, the verbal irony, when his mother tells him to be a man. That's not very nice to say. And obviously, he had just came from what is more manly, people would say, than being the soldier. And then dramatic irony. This is what the reader knows, but the characters do not. So we as the reader, we understand that Krebs went through this very serious trauma, even though not much was told from it. But as we analyze the story and with Hemingway's iceberg method, we have to pull this. So we know that we as readers know that every little thing Hemingway is saying is important to the story. So you could say the dramatic irony, the readers know that he's really struggling, but people in the story, his family, do not. This just breaks down our summary of our story. Opening with him returning home, giving us his little return. He was a student before this, a college student, and a little bit about his day. Then these would be our events, him observing, him having conversations with his mother and sister. And our climax is the confrontation with his mother. Don't you love your mother, dear boy? And Krebs says he doesn't love anything. And would be his kind of moment of truth, where he's basically is trying to tell his mother, I have a lot wrong with me and I, need help. But back in the early post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't have even been a thing, even have been recognized or talked about until after the Vietnam War. So that'd have been 1980s. So this would have just been she's wondering like why my dad went through this and he was okay, but for her we don't really know. So then he's seeing his mother in distress, cries, tells he's going to feel he'll try. He's disgusted with himself and he decides to leave. And then that's our final paragraph where he says he moves to Kansas City, but there's no emotional resolution. He remains attached, accepting his inability to connect. The story ends ambiguously with Krebs watching his sister play baseball. So that would have been like his final moments there. And the resolution, our interpretation from this iceberg method, the very little Krebs told us, he struggles with, isolation and these feelings for the rest of his life. And this central idea, you could kind of formulate it from one of the themes. The psychological scars of war create an unbridgeable gap between veterans and the society they return to, leading to profound alienation and loss of identity. You could also have a central idea where you focus more specifically on World War I and like the historical aspect. You could say something like Ernest Hemingway's short story Soldier's Home reveals to readers the devastating effects World War I veterans faced and a society they returned to that didn't meet all their needs. And then you could find some statistics about suicide rates for World War I veterans or um, anything like that. You could find more things about the war if you wanted to focus an essay on both the story, obviously, because it's a literary analysis, but then a historical literary analysis. You add some historical facts from into your essay. But this would just be your typical text only. You would only need to look at the text for a thesis like this.